So with our discussion on ripeness theory, we kind of introduced the idea that civil wars now tend to end with negotiated settlement, that's become the most common way to see these conflicts end in the post-Cold War period. But when we think about negotiations in the context of civil war, there's some things that are a little bit different than the kind of negotiations we have with interstate conflicts and the kind of negotiations you'd have sort of with interpersonal conflicts in your everyday life or in business. And so I want to talk about negotiations with a real focus on civil wars, although, of course, some of what we'll be covering is more general and perhaps more applicable beyond this context. So one of the things that is really essential in negotiating civil wars, and even just getting that process starting, is trust building. Because civil wars tend to be a situation in which people have been, shooting at each other for extended periods of time, there's incredible distrust, there's incredible animosity, there's, agendas and goals and things that different actors want that are at diametrical opposition, right? So one of the things that the Syrian opposition would have loved to see in the Syrian civil war is for Assad to be killed, like that, or at least thrown from power. And Assad very much wants to stay in power, so those things, and probably not be killed. And so those things are diametrically opposed, and it's hard to imagine how a conflict resolution process could possibly work. And so you need some sort of mechanism to start building trust between the parties so they'll actually start inching toward negotiations. And the reason why this is so difficult in civil wars isn't just because the parties are diametrically opposed and been shooting at each other. It's also because parties maybe are resistant to taking incremental steps to show signs of trust. Reciprocity is a common approach that we use to build trust. I do a small gesture, you do a small gesture in return. I recognize that you seem to be interested in cooperation. We take maybe slightly larger gestures. So I do a prisoner release, or I lift a curfew. You release people that have been kidnapped, and maybe withdraw forces from a particular area. And we start doing these sort of incremental things and start gaining a sense that maybe we can work together and we're both serious about this. But a lot of those small steps that we take can be viewed by our supporters as a sign of weakness. Oftentimes there's a flank within any coalition that's more on the hardline side, and they might denounce this. They might try to spoil that peace process. They might end up breaking your organization apart, or they might try to block it. And so it can be difficult to navigate through that. And it's hard for parties to know what is genuinely threatening a peace process versus what is just hardliners posturing and positioning. In addition to that, a lot of those incremental steps can be things that potentially leave you vulnerable, right? And so if I'm withdrawing my forces from an area, retaking that area might be really difficult, or bring them back in. Or if I, send my forces back to their barracks, I'm potentially leaving myself exposed to exploitation or betrayal by the other side. And so there's a vulnerability that comes with a lot of the things that we're asking parties to do as part of a process of starting conflict resolution. And that ends up being true in many situations, but in civil wars, I think it's magnified and really becomes a barrier to this kind of settlement. I'll also flag that once parties decide that they want to actually negotiate, there are a whole host of what we call pre-negotiation issues to get resolved, kind of the nuts and bolts of how this is going to work. Everything from who's going to be invited to where the talk's going to take place to what's the shape of the table. What kind of communication processes will there be? What are the issues that might be discussed? What issues will not be discussed? All of these kind of things get negotiated before parties ever even sit down. And so this major elements for pre-negotiation box that I have, people could maybe look at it, but really I'm using this box because I wanted to remind myself to talk about this book, Democracy and Deep-Rooted Conflict, Options for Negotiators. It's fantastic. Somewhere online there's a PDF kicking around of this thing. It was published in 1998, and for me personally, this book was life-changing. And literally, I was working at Transparency International in Berlin, and I was working in their archives, and they were going through, and they were calling things that they didn't think were specifically corruption related. And one of these was this book, Democracy and Deep-Rooted Conflict. And so I took it home, and on my train ride back, I was reading it. And I was in awe. I was fascinated about the kind of practical nuts and bolts things that go into figuring out how to get parties to work together and solve their problems. And so that ended up being the kernel for me to decide that I wanted to pursue an academic career and research this and investigate this. And so I frequently look back on this book as sort of that turning point that set my trajectory in terms of research and in scholarship, and in terms of my academic development around getting parties to cooperate in difficult circumstances. So that's my sort of personal side note that I'll interject here because it's particularly relevant, but just to know that there's a whole host of things that parties will need to negotiate over before they're willing to sit down and actually talk about substantive issues. Once they're there, once they're at the table, once they're able to talk about substantive issues, there's really a couple critical tasks that need to happen. And so that process of trust building really needs to continue, right? And parties in civil wars, again, they need to reaffirm their commitment to resolving this. If you don't get that kind of trust deepening throughout the process, you're not going to get to a final agreement. And this can happen in all sorts of ways, both big and small. I think in the Camp David Accords, Jimmy Carter sort of famously would, as Begin and Sadat would approach a door, Jimmy Carter would sort of hang back a little bit, and he'd make sure that he was the last one through. And so that Begin and Sadat had to make a choice when they reached the door. Did they open the door and then slam it behind them to block out the other person and also slam the door on Jimmy Carter, or do you open the door and hold it open while the other party goes through and then Jimmy Carter goes through? And that those simple actions of "I will hold the door for you" were, according to Jimmy Carter, valuable in getting the parties to see each other as people that they could work with, and that they could be polite and engage with as human beings rather than as adversaries. So continue to build trust. Information exchange. Negotiations are about communicating back and forth about what are your interests, what are your goals, how are you about to go and achieve those. And I think that process of information exchange is really important, because part of the process of negotiations is shifting how parties think about what they want in a way that is compatible with what the other party is needing. And so sometimes we talk in negotiation theory about shifting from demands to meeting demands to meeting interests or needs, right? That we can have demands that are diametrically opposed, but when we drill down and understand each other and understand where those demands are coming from, we find that there's other ways to meet those needs and those interests that can be satisfied without fulfilling that actual demand that might be diametrically opposed. And we find that there's actually ways to resolve these things. But the problem is that people are oftentimes hesitant to reveal information about what they are negotiating on. So I'll share an example. When I went to buy an engagement ring a number of years ago, I walked into the first jewelry store and said, I've saved up X amount of dollars. I'd like to see an engagement ring. And they showed me only engagement rings that were $500 more than that dollar value I cited them. They're trying to upsell me. I understand that. And I couldn't afford it. And so I walked out the door and I went to the jewelry store right next door. And I said, I have some money. I'd like to buy an engagement ring. And I only have, X minus $500 available. And they showed me rings that were exactly my price range, right? And so there's this idea with negotiations that you don't want to give away, like, this is the absolute bottom line of what I'm willing to accept, because suddenly that becomes the new negotiating point, which the people will try and push you a little bit further. But if you don't open up and share that information, that process of looking for a solution ends up being really inefficient and can be frustrating, and negotiations will fail. So there's a tension there that parties have to navigate. You also have to start figuring out how to move from specific issues. These are things that we want to talk about, to putting it all together into a comprehensive peace agreement, to get away from those demands and sort of move to something that's practical, that's implementable, that has timelines associated with it, that has monitoring, enforcement associated with it, and to do that in a way where I might lose on a particular issue, but I'll gain on a different issue, right? That we're maybe making trades across a very complex and messy problem. And again, that book, Democracy and Deep-Rooted Conflict, is just really fantastic for talking about how you get parties to do that, right? So it might be something as simple as, let's prioritize what are the most important things to us. And I rank them 1, 3, 5, 8, and you rank, 8, 5, 3, 1. And we discover that we care about very different things. We care about things very differently, and different issues in very different ways. And because of that, I can get my preferred option, and you can get your preferred option, and we both have maybe sacrificed only a little bit from our own perspectives, right? That can be helpful. Sometimes you take somebody else's proposal and do a yes, but, well, actually scratch yes, but, yes, and I like what you've given me. I see how we can work with this, and I want to make it better, and here's how we make it better for meeting my needs and my interests. Sometimes it makes sense to break issues apart, that it becomes just overwhelming to try to tackle all these different issues at once. And so you send people off into subgroups and say, okay, I need you to come up with a workable solution to this very specific problem. In other situations, you want people, in the middle of the messiness, so that you can have those trades back and forth to get a solution. So there's a transition process from, here's sort of what's sometimes called a formula or a framework of, here's how we figured out how to resolve these issues, to the nuts and bolts of what's on paper and how that's actually going to play out in practice. And while I'm not going to run through a comprehensive list of the kind of things that get tackled in these agreements, there's data sets out there that code peace agreements, Peace Accord Matrix and PAX. We'll look at 50 to 150 different dimensions, ranging from everything from, are there provisions related to child soldiers, are there provisions related to, economic development, are there provisions related to promoting athletics, are there provisions related to promoting women's equality or empowerment, right? There's lots of things that can be built into these peace agreements, but the three that seem to be, really critical sticking points in a lot of these agreements tend to focus on how are you going to divide political power? Right? Is there going to be some sort of power sharing mechanism in place where you have a formula, the cabinet will be divided this way? Maybe there's a co-presidency or a tripartite presidency, as I think they use in Lebanon. Are you going to have, something in the electoral system that promises that parties will have, adequate representation, so that they're going to be, there at the table? Or maybe you rely upon autonomy, right? I'm not going to give you independence, but I'll allow for your region to, govern itself on these, 10 issues, right? And maybe that works, but those tend to be, pretty deep sticking points. A second issue that really ends up creating problems in civil wars, and this is something that I think is really unique to civil wars, is that process of disarmament and demobilization is oftentimes necessary to be able to end the violence, right? The rebels have to lay down guns, and they have to go home and stop functioning as rebel militaries. Or maybe they get integrated into the military that exists, which can be really awkward to have people who've been fighting each other suddenly sharing a barracks. But that process in a civil war is oftentimes asymmetric. And what I mean by that is, it's often the rebels who are laying down guns. It's often the rebels who are demobilizing. But the state security apparatus remains intact, right? There's still police. There's still a military. And if the state decided that it wanted to renege on a peace agreement, to return to violence, to not enforce provisions of an agreement, or not to follow provisions of an agreement, rebels who disarmed and demobilized are at an incredibly vulnerable position when that happens relative to the state. And so figuring out how to resolve that in a way that doesn't leave rebels feeling deeply vulnerable and unwilling to make that kind of agree to those kind of changes is really the toughest nut to crack in civil wars. We'll talk about strategies for how that gets done when we talk about peacekeeping. But then I'll flag this final one, the question of what do you do when there have been atrocities that have been committed, right? And there's maybe demands amongst the population or even the international community for some mechanism of justice or some mechanism for societal healing. But perpetrators of horrific crimes oftentimes don't want to be held accountable for their horrific crimes, and they may be wanting amnesty. And that can again be kind of a really difficult sticking point, not just because you have very diametrically opposed, I don't want to be prosecuted, you want to prosecute me kind of demands, but also because once you've laid down your weapons, once the conflict is over, if one of the sides decides, well, we promised you amnesty, but we've decided to take that away, and now we're going to prosecute you, do you have a response or a recourse for that? And so the enforceability of some of these provisions in the longer term is potentially terrifying to conflict participants, and may make them very resistant to settling in civil war situations in a way that we don't necessarily see in other kinds of conflict or business or interpersonal situations.